Buenas tardes. Sean ustedes bienvenidos a esta sesión inaugural.
Good afternoon and welcome to this opening session of this third cycle of Mediterranean dialogues that we have been organizing with the European Institute of the Mediterranean. And as I said before, this is the third time that we start a cycle of this nature, very much focused naturally in Mediterranean issues. So firstly, I would like to thank our partners from EMED, with whom it's a great pleasure to work with, as you can see, because of their closeness and naturalness. EMED has a great advantage, and I'm here to speak in front of the General Director, but the great advantage is that it has friendships with everybody in all Mediterranean countries and excellent relationships. And I believe there's no other institution that has this capacity of warm and close dialogue with all other institutions, cities, academies, and people in the public and in the business world in the Mediterranean region. So working with EMED is a great pleasure, and we're very happy to organize a cycle of this nature as Club de Roma and Fundación La Caixa as partners. Thank you to the speakers as well. It's a great pleasure to have you here. It's a true pleasure, and all participants and the people who have wanted to be part of this EMED in person and live. And also, we won't be able to have here the presence of one of the two Club de Roma participants, Mampela, the Club of Rome, as well. We're very fortunate to be the only international institution with a co-presidency or chairmanship regime for a few years now. And it's something curious, but it does work. And additionally, in our case, and in this joint chairmanship, both chairmen or chairwomen in this case are women, Manfela Ramfele and Ellen Dixon from Belgium. So we have this joint presidency regime. And a few months ago, while preparing this cycle with EMED, we were right in some things and wrong in some others. First, we've decided to title this cycle Changing Mediterranean Climate When Adaptation Becomes a Priority. And a few months later now, adaptation is not a priority. Adaptation is now a vital need, a pressing and unexcusable vital need. It's not about adapting better in the sense of priority. It is much more than a priority now, and we have seen obvious proof of this, and it is a vital need. So, regarding the importance and the emergency of adaptation to climate change in the Mediterranean, well, this is a cycle, but we were right in the title of the cycle of this session, because this was called, Are We Ready for the Heat? With a question mark, as you will remember. And we were right. We were right. We were too right, in a way. It is very important and very accurate to talk about this today, because this summer we have experienced phenomena, without wanting to be dramatic, but we have in the Mediterranean had some extreme temperatures, and in our region we have experienced extreme heat waves, droughts, fires, uncontrollable fires in some of the Mediterranean countries, of floods. And as the icing of the cake, the storm in Libya that has produced all the devastation that we are seeing these days, where hundreds of tens of thousands of people, women, men, children, a high proportion of children, unfortunately, have been victims of this phenomenon, which in part is due to the absence of forecast or adaptation to climate change. A considerable part of these casualties could have been avoided if we had acted more responsibly, foreseeing and adapting to the change and the potential consequences of this change. A moment will come in the near future when the urgency or the lack of responsibility or the little responsibility in terms of adaptation to climate change will be an offense, a punishable offense. So in those cases where authorities have not been capable, with everything that we know, with everything that is happening at a worldwide scale and nationally as well, it is unforgivable, and I'm sorry for being dramatic, but that is how it is. In not acting with our full capacity and still holding Byzantine debates on whether we should control or not the tunnels of low emissions, and that is a priority, everything that allows us to prevent climate change or at least be prepared for it. It is, or it will be, punishable, and not being responsible in that way. So at any rate, I would like to repeat my thanks to the organizers and our partners and everybody intervening today. And without further ado, we will hear from Roger Vinyana from the EMED. Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Jaume. And I will now be switching to Spanish to make understanding easier by our speakers. So thank you, everybody, for being here today. It is truly an honor to open this new edition of the Med Dialogue cycle, of the 2023 Med Dialogue cycle. And it is an honor to do so with a stimulating title of Are We Ready for the Heat? Because truly, when the EMED team, led by Antoine, thought about the concept together with the Club of Rome and the La Caixa Foundation, with this cycle of conferences, was all before the summer. And we have seen how these features of the summer are becoming more and more extreme in our latitudes, and we've seen how this summer we have experienced severe heat waves, not just here in Catalonia or Spain, but in the Mediterranean altogether, and I would even dare to say in Western and Eastern Europe. I would like to start with a special thank you to Jaume Lanaspa, so joint head of this cycle, and La Caixa Foundation as well, for facilitating and enabling this fabulous space, which is truly impressive. You know that the UNESCO very recently, I believe it was last year, signed a memorandum of understanding with the Kingdom of Spain to declare this venue today as Center for the UNESCO. So it is even more honorable to be able to have this cycle here. I would also like to thank or stress that this is the third edition of the 2030 Med Dialogue cycle. This is a brand we generated to have greater awareness on the need of implementing, on the need of working with the 2030 agenda in the Mediterranean region. Oftentimes, We are submerged in small-scale debates, which are very important on the areas of low emissions or the local policies that we push in order to mitigate or adapt to climate change. But very frequently, we lose sight. And the sight is that no matter how many policies we implement locally, if we're not capable of transferring those dynamics to a regional scale as well, in the case of the Mediterranean, or a global scale, our efforts, well, will never be in vain, but they won't have the effect that we desire. So that Cycle wants to generate awareness on the need of conveying and transferring the local debates to a regional scale in the Mediterranean, where the needs, especially in the chapter of adaptation, which is the main topic or core topic for this cycle, are very necessary, as Jaume was saying before. We started 2 years ago with a cycle on sustainability in the Mediterranean in the widest sense, to place focus and stress in the implementation of the 2030 agenda. Last year, or last academic year, we spoke more about sustainable development and human security, focusing on energy security, food security, healthcare security after the COVID-19 pandemic, water security as well, with all the problems that we're suffering in the Mediterranean basin for access of drinking water. And this new edition, as I was saying, will place its focus on adaptation policies, which are the great pending subject in the Mediterranean, in the entire Mediterranean, but particularly in the southern Mediterranean. What do we want? Well, we want to promote debate on these issues, and doing so with experts and institutional representatives from public institutions, academicians, not only from the north of the Mediterranean countries, such as France. We have Ellen today here with us, coming from Montpellier, France, but as well, and especially with experts and representatives of the southern Mediterranean countries, to give a voice, and also with a gender perspective, which is very relevant and interesting, because frequently when you approach representatives, especially scientists and academicians, there's a great unbalance nowadays between men and women. So what we have tried to do with the Club of Rome and the La Caixa Foundation is to try and capture and invite basically female experts and representatives. So we're in the pursuit of this perspective, northern and southern perspective, which is a shared perspective, in order to debate on climate vulnerabilities, the ones that we have in the Mediterranean, which are now more severe than in some other regions in the world, or seeing how this phenomenon is having its impact in everything related to migrations and displacements, human displacements. Many people will say yes, but this has its financial root as well. That is the case. Yes, there is a social and economical problem, which entails movement from south to north and from south to south by people looking for new opportunities. But increasingly, we have seen it in many studies, the climate factor is one of the factors pushing more and more people to migrate from south to south and from south to north. In terms of the impact this has on economy and employment as well, the fields that will disappear as a consequence of climate change and the absence of effective policies in terms of adaptation. And if we look at the bright side of things, the fact that there are new adaptation policies obviously will give rise to new financial sectors and industry. Let's think about those linked to green economy, to the blue economy, to the circular economy, which will as well generate new employment opportunities. Factors that are obviously related with the need of cooperating further regionally and internationally, so that this cooperation has practical effects and specific effects in decisions that are subsequently adopted nationally and internationally, so that we can see the transformation. If we only meet up every year in the COPs and make great decisions, but there's no further will of transposing these decisions nationally or locally, well, obviously we will never be able to move forward. And all this with the goal of progressing in the implementation of the SDGs, the 17 SDGs and the 2030 Agenda. A few months ago in Geneva, precisely, when I met the Vice President of the Club of Rome, the Vice General Director of the UN, in a small meeting that we had there, said, well, I guess that you know that this 2030 Agenda, this was the high top management in the UN. And she was saying this 2030 Agenda will not be implemented. So in the United Nations, we're talking about the 2050 Agenda. It is good that they're thinking about 20 years in the future or into the future, but this is very damaging for the future of the planet, for our region, the fact that we're already abandoning the 2030 Agenda and replacing it with a longer period framework. At any rate, we will continue to work on this topic. Apart from today's sessions, we have 5 more sessions until the month of December, and obviously we will be very happy to accompany you, to welcome you here, and to participate and generate an impact, even though modest or not modest, in the entire debate on the implementation of adaptation policies in the Mediterranean region. And without further ado, because I believe I have gone beyond my time, I would like to thank especially the presence of Ellen representing the CIA Montpellier and Carol representing UNESCO from Lebanon. And before we start today's event with our moderator, thank you very much for accompanying us here as well. I do need to introduce the president of the Club of Rome, joint president, sorry, because no, it's I'm not the one doing that. No video. Okay, no video then. All right, I didn't know about that. No video, so the introductions are now shorter, and we can move on directly to the start of the event, which is why you are all here, of course. So thank you very much. Thank you to the Club of Rome, especially, and the La Caixa Foundation, and to the entire EMED team led by Antoine, who have worked throughout these months in the 3rd edition of the Med Dialogues. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to present and moderate this event. And with this union, I'm so happy that it's a gender panel, that it's not so easy, or not so often you can find these kind of opportunities and in this file, as you say. And this is the first session of this conference cycle that you start 2 years ago. I'm very happy to open this session, that it's the first one that the aim is to provide this first experience and dialogues about this topic, that after it will be more specific in a specific ecosystem like forest and coast, and you have all the program also, so you are very invited to join all these sessions. To start, we will provide a first overview in panorama, overview in Mediterranean basin area with Ellen, and after we will also talk more specific in Arab countries. So, as the colleagues also explain, which is the situation that we are right now. No, we spent a very warmer summer. Here in Catalonia, we also suffer heat waves and drought. It was also very complicated, but the last news show us that in the other side of the Mediterranean, the consequences of this extreme meteorological events are worse. So the idea is not to talk only about the situation, but also to talk about the solutions. But as we saw at the beginning, mitigation was a line that politicals were talking about a lot, but adaptation, it was always in the other side. Not in the other side, but I mean, it was always in very less important side, no? But as we saw, we need to talk about it. And right now we will have more or less 1 hour to talk, and we're really happy to receive your questions at the end of the presentations. And to start, I would like to present Ellen, that as we know, she's coming from Montpellier, and I will introduce you a little bit more, because like this you can have more information and know a little bit more about her background. She's an agricultural economist, water and forest engineer, and doctor in public policy. She worked for the Investment Center of Food and Agriculture Organization of United Nations, FAO, the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the French Ministry of Environment, first on land policies, and then as agriculture, climate, biodiversity, forest, and ocean economist. From 2017 to 2020, she led the Blue Plan for the Environment and Development in the Mediterranean, Plan Bleu, coordinating the preparation of the 2020 report on the state of the environment and development in the Mediterranean, and launching Med 2050 Foresight. Since 2020, she had joined the Mediterranean Agronomic Institute of Montpellier, Montpellier, where she is responsible for the project development and met Amin, a network aiming to strengthen information sharing cooperation on agricultural markets in the Mediterranean region. Thanks for being here. We are waiting for your interview.
So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here today, and thanks to the Club of Roma and Med for inviting me to do this event. So just a few words on what is SIAM. So SIAM is the Center for Higher Education and Cooperation and Development of 13 countries around the Mediterranean, focus on agricultural development, food systems, and rural development. So this organization has been founded in 1962. So it's an older organization, and it's a proof of the willingness of Mediterranean countries to cooperate to find better ways to manage scarce resources. I'm just going to give you a very, very quick overview of some of the challenges the Mediterranean region is facing in terms of climate change, and what does it require for us to adapt. So I'm not going to speak about adaptation right now. I think we'll do that later, but just give you a very fast overview of the magnitude of the issue. So we have seen the magnitude of the issue all over since the month of June. We have had so many events that relate to climate change that it's very, I mean, there's nothing more to say in terms of it being a proof of climate change. It was announced that the 2023 July was the hottest month in the world since it's recorded by the World Mediterranean Organization. The Mediterranean Sea reached the highest temperature ever. We have seen very severe droughts in the Western Mediterranean that have also highly affected crop and grain production, including in Spain, but also in the south of the basin. And we are facing now those horrific floods that are at least in part due to climate change. Obviously, when we think about climate change, not speaking about these tremendous fires that we saw also over the last few months. And I just put you a few newspaper articles, some of them of today and yesterday. So this is extremely current issue. And as I was saying, climate change is a very important factor. And I think now scientists, as much as policymakers, are well aware of the importance of climate change. But in the Mediterranean regions, climate change is actually emphasizing some of the weaknesses that are associated with other issues. And it is the case with the dam ruptures in Libya, for example. There are a number of factors that made the country less resilient and less capable to face the extreme events that are associated with climate change. So that was just a few introduction about the viewpoint of the press. And on the other side, we have the viewpoint of the scientists. And I will base these few words now mostly on three reports. The report by the Mediterranean expert group on climate and environmental change that produced the first report focusing on the impacts of environmental change in the Mediterranean that was published in 2022. The report edited by Plan Bleu on the state of the environment and development in the Mediterranean that look also at the socioeconomic aspects associated with environmental change, climate change being one of the factors among a number of other ones. And more recently, in 2022, the last report by the International Panel on Climate Change, which for the first time had a specific chapter on the Mediterranean region. The first thing we know is, and I think it was already in your introduction, is that the Mediterranean region is warming faster than the rest of the globe. In the last IPCC report, they say in average warming maybe 20% faster than the rest of the globe, having already reached a 1.5 degree increase of temperature before the compared to the pre-industrial period, but even faster in the summer region, and there are even figures of 50% faster in the summer region than in other regions of the globe. So a very quick warming. It is also, this warming is already observed. The decrease in precipitation is also already observed. And I think Carol will describe that in much more details for what we foresee for the future for the region. But it's important to know that the region is already, at least in the south, extremely scarce in water resources. The Mediterranean region only has 3% of the freshwater resources when it represents 7% of the world population. So huge problems of water scarcity and already degrading. So these are the expected changes in precipitation, but I think Carol will present that in more details. What we see is that there will be a lot of variation, but we are expecting in the summer and spring reduction by 10 to 30% in some of the region of the Mediterranean. So this has huge consequences in terms of bioclimatic regions. And in the IPCC report for the Mediterranean, the chapter for the Mediterranean, they are presenting those maps of expected changes in terms of bioclimatic regions if the region increases by 4 degrees, which is not at all impossible. So we see that if I zoomed a little bit on Spain and Morocco, and we see that by the end of the century, of 90 years, this is a complete transformation of the ecosystems at least in this part of the region, with the yellow part is really the arid area, and the red part, the Mediterranean. So the arid climate going up and the Mediterranean climate going up, and Spain in particular, but also France and Morocco really transforming in terms of ecosystems. Those changes have obviously impacts on agricultural yields. And there are many data and many studies. And of course, it differs depending on the assumption we make in terms of increase in heat level. But some of the studies predict up to 60% of reduction in yields with some crops, and in some regions 30 to 60 depending on, and major impacts on grain, absolute tremendous impact on corn production, for example, with impossibility to grow rain-fed corn, and increase in irrigation of some of the traditional crops in the Mediterranean region, like olive and wine. So really a transformation of some of those ecosystems and crop productions. This is a map. I'm not going to go into details, but this very interesting map produced by the IPCC shows the extent, the magnitude of the risks associated with climate change around the Mediterranean region. Just there is a predicted important impact on some of the world's most famous cultural sites and antique sites around the basin, because there is a concentration close to sea level in regions that are going to be impacted by heat, but also by expected sea level rise and an increase in extreme events close to in coastal areas. There are, we spoke about it already, more flooding, degradation and transformation of the marine ecosystems, fires, and the transformation of agriculture. There is also a lot of research on the health impacts associated with climate change. We think about the health impact in cities with the increase in heat, which is further accentuated by the fact that the cities keep the heat and concentrate the heat, and so amplify the impact in the increase in temperature. But there are many other health impacts that are expected. There are new diseases that are spreading through vectors that are moving up from tropical areas up to the Mediterranean region. There are also an increase in water salinity due to the rise in sea level and the overexploitation of water resources, which is also expected to have impact on cardiac health. There are many factors that are intervening in this situation. To describe the impact of climate change, very important to keep in mind what are the other trends in the basin, around the basin, and in particular, how is the demography evolving? And the fact that in the basin, in the Mediterranean region, we have a concentration of major urban centers close to the coastal areas where we concentrate infrastructure, ports, activities, and people, is part of the vulnerability of the region, with an expected increase in many of those major urban centers that are directly at risk of impacts associated with climate change, in particular on the south and east part of the basin. I was speaking very quickly of marine areas, fishery resources, marine biodiversity. I think you will have a specific session on these aspects, but here again, it's important to understand how fast those systems are transforming. With now in the eastern part of the basin, for example, some species that come from tropical origin are now being completely prevalent and dominant in some of those ecosystems. This is amplified by the impact of climate change, very visible on some of the fish resources, but also by the very high level of overexploitation of the fish stocks in the Mediterranean region. So overexploitation renders the stocks more vulnerable to climate change and more difficult to adapt. So we consider at the moment there is about 80% of the fish stocks in the Mediterranean Sea that are overexploited, with very few success stories. The the heat, we speak about the heat, we speak about the precipitation. It's also important when we speak about marine ecosystem to think about the acidification, which again is already showing in the Mediterranean. The fact that the sea is becoming more acidic is already affecting some of the resources, being the corals for biodiversity, but also the shellfish that we exploit. So in this context, I hope I was not too negative, and we are going to speak about adaptation afterwards, but I wanted to say for this introduction that systems, the changes are so rapid that systems are actually already adapting. We have regions like the Nile region, which is going to be majorly impacted by a number of factors associated with climate change, including salination, including sea level rise, and those systems are already transforming. We have, for example, a decrease in rice production, an incredibly fast increase in fish farmings that are well adapted to brackish waters. And the question for me is, okay, we will adapt, we have to adapt, there is no other choice. Systems are going to transform, but are we transforming fast enough? Are we transforming with the right solutions? Are those solutions going to face thresholds and risk of really meeting their limits? And for whom are we adapting, with whom, who are going to benefit from those adaptations, those new systems, and whom may be left aside? So I think that will be part of the debate. Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Ellen, for this introduction. I think you put all the questions that I had noted, so but we will discuss once we will finish with the next presentation. But it was nice to have this overview. No, we talk about physical impacts, but also in the weather, also in the economic activities, in the ecosystems. So it's really everywhere. So it's true that you say we have to adapt, but we have to see if we are in the path or we have to run. I think it's more the second, but we will talk about this later. I would like to introduce you right now, Carol Sherfane. She directs the Arab Center for Climate Change Policies and leads the Climate Change and Natural Resource Sustainability Cluster at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia in Beirut. Her work support intergovernmental process and interagency partnership on water, energy, food security, and biodiversity, as well as regional action on climate change. She previously led the water resources section in this organization and coordinated a Mediterranean environmental policy initiative at Harvard University for World Bank. Her 25 years of experience in sustainable development are completed by studies in development economics, law, and international environmental policy at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Thanks for your intervention.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Thank you very much, Judith. Thank you, Ellen, for a great overview, puts set the stage on the Arab perspective. And I'd also like to thank Imed and our hosts here at the Cassia Foundation for moving us forward to address this pressing issue. So what we are doing at ESQA, we are one of 5 regional commissions that serve the Secretary General that, as you know, are meeting right now in New York to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, climate, and all these pressing challenges that we have to address at the same time. There are so many crises happening, and we are looking at the climate dimension, but we really have to look at this within the context of development at large, be it to achieve the 2030 agenda or beyond, where we hope to even refine further. You know, as you remember, there was the Millennium Development Goals, very general, Sustainable Development Goals, a lot more ambitious, and we have to move beyond because the science and the policy are changing and improving. And what we are showing, actually, by what Ellen was showing and the new information that is generated to advance policy and projects to address these goals is a moving target. And that is thanks to our knowledge and our ability to respond and adapt. So what I'm going to share with you today, moving? Ça marche? Oh, okay, voila. Is to put a little bit of perspective from the southern Mediterranean region that complements what we've heard today and the illustrious introductions, as well as what was presented for the Mediterranean region. And just to put some figures on this, I mean, here you are in Spain, you have been suffering already, Barcelona, Madrid, from the floods and the heat waves. In the southern Mediterranean, it's even worse. So you can imagine. We're already seeing Algeria and Libya and Mauritania having increasing temperatures, much above the average that has been experienced between 1990 and 2020. You can see the increase in temperature there. But the percentage change in temperature from Morocco and Tunisia, while it's not as high as the other countries in the northern Med, in the southern Med, the percentage change, over 6% change in the average from Morocco. That is the fruit basket that brings a lot of agricultural products here to Spain. The connectivity between Spain and Morocco is fundamental. And they are experiencing right now, not only the dramatic tragedy of the earthquake that happened just a couple of weeks ago, not to mention what happened in Libya with the flood, we'll get to that later, but they are experiencing some dramatic effects, and that is changing the way that they have to work and the need for transforming and considering the needs for adaptation even further. So why are we talking about this in the Arab region? There is so much excellent work being done by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and in the Mediterranean region to look and examine what is the science regarding climate change. The challenge is when you look at how they look at the regions and the regional analysis that the global community and this regional community is looking, it's very hard for the Arab states that go from Morocco to Oman and Saudi Arabia and the UAE and south to all the way Comoros and Djibouti to Iraq. It's hard for them to talk together when they do not have a region where they can draw analysis to make their collective policies and programs and positioning, quite honestly, in the climate change negotiations. This map shows how the IPCC organizes their regions. Again, wonderful information, taking global information and dividing it up into regional analysis. But I think you can see quite well, while there is a Med, there isn't an Arab region. It's divided between the Sahel, the Arab Peninsula, Western Asia. Lebanon, where I am coming from, is split right along the mountains. You've got 10 meters of coast in one regional analysis and the rest on the other side. So it's very hard for even a country to be able to use this information to inform its national adaptation plans and its policies. And that's where we come in. We have been working with the League of Arab States for over a decade and all the members and partners of the Arab Ministerial Water Council, the Arab Ministerial Council responsible for the environment, metrology, another ministerial council, and others to better understand what climate means for the region. And to do that, you need the science, as was just presented. And we do this in the Arab region in two ways. Since 2010, we've been supporting the Arab states with an Arab domain, so that the analysis that is used in the IPCC is complemented by regional analysis that does not only think about the Arab states, but all those environmental pressures that affect the climate for Arab states. So you can't only think about the borders of the Arab region and the countries that are members of the League of Arab States, you also have to think about the headwaters of the Nile, because what happens down in Ethiopia and in Kenya is going to affect what happens in the Nile Delta. You have to think about what's happening in the Indian Ocean to see what about Oman and those cyclones that are hitting Oman and Yemen, and what's happening in the headwaters of Turkey to see, and Iran, to see what it means for Iraq, Syria, and downstream countries. So this is why we have an Arab domain where we started our work, and we have modeling outputs that we do with our partners at 50 kilometers squared. So think of a camera where you have 50-kilometer boxes and you're modeling inside every box a scenario. And just recently, and just off the presses literally a week ago, we finished our second set of ensembles for the Mediterranean, for the Mashriq area, which is that second smaller box, where we have modeling outputs at a 10-kilometer scale. Why is this fundamental? Why does this help science and policy? Is that Lebanon, for example, has a lot of mountains. You have beautiful mountains here also outside of Barcelona. If we don't have smaller scales of analysis to really understand those microclimates, then we don't get enough information to be able to change the way we address issues like forest fires or flood or coastal zone challenges. So those finer resolution outputs that we are generating with our partners help us better prepare and provide the science to inform our policies and projects further. All this, I'll be describing a little bit of the analysis, and is freely available for anyone who wants to do research on our RICAR Regional Knowledge Hub. I do want to say, though, ESCWA is the coordinator of this initiative, where we support the League of Arab States in this effort, but we do not do this alone. We have a dozen partners and many more who use the data that we collaborate to have this regional knowledge hub that is openly available, all the data. Anyone who uses ArcGIS can download also and make their own maps from the information I will share now. And this is, again, available for that Mashreq domain that I was just showing, as well as the entire Arab. And if you can see, Spain is part of that Arab domain because it does cover the northern Mediterranean, because we want to make sure that the parts of, again, the headwaters of Iraq, of the Euphrates River are there. So you do have part of Spain showing in the maps that will be shared right now. So we've heard what it means, again, the warming temperatures. These are the results. And I'm sorry, the visuals are a little bit skewed, I think, in the presentation on this presentation, but it's okay. You get the sense here that in the moderate scenario, we are seeing that temperatures, as it gets yellower, you're seeing it's getting hotter and the changes are getting worse or more dramatic for the region, where compared not to the pre-industrial era, okay? But we are comparing to the start of this century, this millennium, that already since the start of this millennium, that's 20 years, 25 years, temperatures have already increased by 0.8 degrees, okay? The world and the IPCC are talking about making global temperatures underneath 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to 1850. We're talking already now, we're at over 0.8 degrees higher than the beginning of this century. This is dramatic. And we are going to see, even compared again to the beginning of this millennium, an increase in 2.6 degrees Celsius for the moderate, optimistic scenario if we all work together on mitigation. If it's business as usual, which I think we are doing better than business as usual from before, but if we were a business as usual, we will see those 4.8, almost 5 degrees Celsius increases by the end of the century. It's not feasible, not only for the land-based ecosystems and people, but also for the seas, as was mentioned, that bind us here in the Mediterranean basin. Temperature is easy. We know it's getting hotter. Precipitation is tricky. It's very tricky to model, because when it gets hotter, the seas get warmer, you evaporate more, and it actually rains more. So the question is where that variability is and how that changes when we think about an average change in rainfall. Some places are getting wetter and some places are getting drier. You can see the browns, for example, in Morocco and Tunisia and also in Spain, it's getting drier on these scenarios. Again, you see the midpoint and end of century compared to the start of the century at the moderate 4.5 scenario. And you're seeing it much drier as you go towards that business as usual red line at the bottom. Look at the end of the century, it could be dramatically less, just like Spain. All of Spain is going to be in the dry by then. The issue, though, is not only the less rainfall. The issue is also the variability. And that is what we are seeing so dramatically. What happened in Libya is because things are changing and the temperature, the sea is warming and Greece is getting warmer. And that's just coming across the Mediterranean. That's what connects us. So we have to think about changing the precipitation in terms of annual, perhaps losses, but also more extreme events that will actually bring more disasters. And that's what we are going to talk a little bit more here. Another indicator that we like to use, it's something that we have created actually in our work globally. And actually in Spain, you probably have the same view. Globally, people think that it's hot when it's 35 degrees Celsius. Not in the south. Okay, that's like that's a normal day, 33, 35 degrees Celsius. So we count the number of hot days above 40. No one in the world uses this as an indicator, but we use this as an indicator because otherwise It's every day, not every day, but generally it would be very significant. So our indicators, so we show how much more significant the changes in temperature is. You are seeing that the number of days above 40 degrees Celsius is increasing. Same idea in the moderate scenario, 4.5, or in the business as usual. And look at that at the bottom. It's all red. It's all red, going to up to 80 more days in a region that already has most of the days already at that degrees. Again, the human body cannot handle this. So how are we going to deal with the adaptation threats? What does this then deal with extreme events? Some figures, and this is, again, just goes up to 2021. There are more recent figures, but this shows the table. So we can see that the number and frequency of floods have been increasing the most over time. When we see the disaster events facing Arab countries and the Arab region, floods are the most numerous that we are seeing, and that is unfortunately what's happening in Libya as well, with the intensity that hit the area, as well as the infrastructure that was not proofed to the climate to be able to maintain the rainfall that happened. So floods are important and are the most important natural disasters affecting the Southern Med. But the number of people affected, it's mostly droughts. That's the green. So we have to also make our policy choices. We look at the frequency of events, that's floods, but the amount of people, and a drought is not, a one-off event. It's over months, it's depending or years, depending on what indicator you're using. So both of these in tandem have to be addressed, and those are crises, again, in tandem when you think about how to deal with adaptation. While we think about impacts, floods, droughts, changes in temperature, what we are really focused at ESCWA in our RICAR initiative here that looks at the socioeconomic impact of climate change is what it means for vulnerability. And the flip side of vulnerability is how we can enhance climate resilience. To do that, it's not just about exposure to the changes. Very simply, Lebanon, where I come from, is in an economic freefall. Lots of difficulty, difficult governance structures, and a lot of changes. UAE also gets floods like Lebanon. UAE has the capacity to adapt. Lebanon, at this case, does not. So your adaptive capacity, not only your exposure to the climate phenomenon, but your ability to handle and respond to those challenges is fundamental. And this is, sort of like the disaster risk communities right now. That's what a lot of people talk about. But we are really grounded in looking at those socioeconomic vulnerabilities, because if you enhance your adaptive capacity to offset your vulnerability, you can really switch the balance on the exposure being felt by climate change. And that's where the development goals, the sustainable development goals, play so much importance here. And not only looking at adaptation as a biophysical story, but looking at a whole of society, whole of government approach that looks at reinforcing adaptive capacity, be it how we frame it for our modeling exercise, looking at knowledge, looking at technology, infrastructure, institutions, economic resources, and vulnerable groups that allow us to think about equity, action, ability, and awareness. That's all part of the climate story also. And that's when we think about loss and damage. That's when we think about resilience. It's not just what is happening in the sky and on the land, but how we are able to cope and deal with it. And all of this is needed as we think about adaptation. So just to be quick, as we want to hear your questions as well, we use this model to model what vulnerability is, not only the impacts. Before you saw the impacts of climate change. When we use that methodology and think about vulnerability, we have a different map. Because indeed, while the vulnerability, when we think comparatively across Arab states, Rabat, Morocco, and Tunisia and Libya have are affected by this, but then look at the ability of the least developed countries in the region to handle these stresses. We see across that the most vulnerable to climate change are in the southern part of the Arab region, in these least developed countries. For example, Somalia might have more rain in the future, but their ability to cope, they don't have that adaptive capacity. And that's going to then go into the story of climate justice, as Roger had mentioned today, and how to deal with those offsets, because this is the vulnerability of the region because of changes in water availability. This is how it looks when you think about water availability for crops. Look how much red it's getting in the business as usual scenario. Look how the southern Med, look at Yemen, southern Sudan, southern part of Sudan, even bottom part of Mauritania, how that is really affected by the ability to cope and have water available for their rural development and for crops. And then in the end, what it means for people. In the end, we're talking about people. Of course, we care about the environment, all of us, but we're looking at human society. And this is what will happen. Look at how much red, how much more vulnerable, even in the north, in the southern Med, in Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria. This will be the story if we do not address climate challenges. And the vulnerability here means that people will migrate from rural areas to urban and migrate south-south and south-north. So just to wrap it up, I just want to show that you can use these tools for your own research, for your own analysis. We do this at the country level to support Jordan, for example, and work we're doing on climate SDG debt swaps and done the analysis to help them better target their interventions. We do this in Lebanon and countries that request us to better inform their policies. For example, this is Nahar al-Kabir, which is a watershed in Lebanon that goes from the sea to the ski slopes in Lebanon, using the new data that allows us to think about vulnerability across topographies. And we have used this to inform their preparation of projects, dealing with wildfires, dealing with aridity, dealing with agricultural production and impacts on apples. I hope everyone knows, like Spain is known for your oranges, Lebanon is known for the apples. So that's the reduction in production that we see because of climate with our new outputs. All this type of science is being used by countries to help inform their adaptation plans, where they have identified sectors of importance. I'm going long, so all those sectors that were mentioned by Hélène are already mentioned as priority sectors by countries and helps to inform the negotiations and priorities of financing, because indeed, nothing happens without financing. And unfortunately, we see in our region, and quite honestly, it's parallel globally, adaptation doesn't get the finance it needs. In our region, in the Arab region, it gets 1/3 of the amount of financing compared to mitigation. It's easy to fund mitigation. People can do it on their own. You can buy your own solar panel. In Lebanon, they're all over the place. In Egypt now, they're all over the place. But it's hard to fund adaptation. And therefore, the flows are going to the mitigation start and not going to adaptation and dealing with the reality that exists there. Also, the flows are not sufficient. And all the commitments that the Arab states have submitted to the UNFCCC, there has been an ask of 570 billion over a 10-year period. It sounds like a lot, but it's really not a lot when you think how much that they are targeting globally 100 billion a year for climate finance. But regardless of what the ask is, the amount they've gotten over the 10-year period is under 35 billion for all the Arab countries. Again, it sounds like a lot, but it's really not a lot when you compare it to the needs. And unfortunately, out of the amount received, a lot of it is debt. So that gets me back to the first story, right? Polycrisis. We have issues related to climate change. We have conflict. We have mobility. We have health justice, social justice, climate justice. If they don't have the financial space to address this, how are they going to act on climate? And that's where we really need to work together. So this is as much Spanish as I'm going to say in my presentation. We need to work together to deal with the adaptation story and the mitigation story, because if we don't, it's really going to be a failure of not only the state, but of our global community. So we have to work together to be able to move forward on the SDGs and climate action. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Carol, for this really interesting introduction in Arabic countries and Mediterranean South Basin area. I think that we have right now the general focus, but also the particular points in these countries. And we say that if we are, the title of this discussion is if we are ready for the heat. So this a word that was all the time, that is adaptation. But what it means, adaptation? which are the challenges, and if we are prepared for this. Who wants to start?
Rest my voice. Go ahead.
So it's a very vast question, so it's difficult to answer in one word. I think we can say a number of things, but we have seen the speed of some of those phenomena. So I'm keeping wondering, and that's a personal concern, if we are really, we need to speak about adaptation or we need to speak about transformation. Because at some point, the phenomena are going so fast that it's a matter of reinventing the systems of the future that are going to be adapted to those new constraints. But it's really a change of paradigm in some of the areas where we work. We have to reinvent the activities of tomorrow, the way the people are going to live. We have to really transform the way we see the cities, transform the way we see agriculture, and transform the way we connect with each other. So I think we have to think really ambitious. And there are many initiatives around the basin, many initiatives to adapt, sometimes to adapt within the same paradigm, to try to find, for example, seeds which are more resilient to drought, seeds which are more resilient to salinity. But more and more we see that the research is trying to go beyond that. It's going to do that, and also to think of what are the new crops that are going to grow here tomorrow, and how are we going to integrate the knowledge that comes from a lot of different sources. And I think one of the main challenge of adaptation or transformation, we call it as we want, is that very often it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. We spoke about success stories at local level, but part of the challenge is that we have to redesign solutions that are adapted to the local level. Because, for example, what we did when we did the Green Revolution in agriculture to invent something that would work almost everywhere. I mean, we need just to mobilize more water, more fertilizers, more land, and we had somehow more machinery, and we had a green revolution. But this, in the context of climate change, is hitting a lot of boundaries in a lot of the Mediterranean basin. And the solutions that are maybe more adapted to the new conditions, very often they are a local solution. They have to be adapted. And the information that is provided and that you show which type of information do we need to really find solutions that are adapted to each water base. And having this scientific information is only part of the solution. We need the scientific information. We need the local knowledge. We need to find some time. I worked in different countries, but I worked also in research centers in countries where they combine archaeology of what the population, how they irrigated thousands of years ago, and combine that with the more cutting-edge science, and they reinvent a system that works locally based on all this knowledge. So that's one of the challenges of adaptation, is how do you make it adapted to the local system? And that means working all together in a local environment and being completely integrating different disciplines, because at the same time, climate is changing, but a lot of other aspects are changing. Population are moving, knowledge is being wasted, nutrition is changing. So what the consumer demands is changing. So local, multi-actor, interdisciplinary, and then is the question, the introduction speech mentioned, the second challenge is how do you scale that up? How do you invent the right instruments to be able to foster those local dynamics, not just in a number of very small locations, as we see it happening at the moment, but at a more general scale around the Mediterranean basin. And I think some of the answer is cooperation, but maybe we'll speak about that later.
Yeah, no, it was the question I will put for Carol, that cooperation then it's crucial.
Yes, of course. And again, building that on how you cooperate and how you organize cooperation. First, just to pick up on the word systems. That is what we are looking at. Again, we're not looking at just one climate change impact on one crop. So again, impact on wheat, for example, is very fundamental. And we've all seen what that happened when wheat production fell because of climate outputs and water scarcity, Morocco, Egypt, and Spain, I'm sure also, and multiplied with the Ukraine-Russian crisis on wheat imports, what that means for society at large and the cost. So looking at cooperation, but looking at the systems that are in which we have to cooperate is important. So there's a food system that we talk about now. We don't talk about only food security. We talk about a food system and how it's affected by climate. We talk about water security, no question, in our region, but it's the water system. And I'm very proud to say that Egypt, as convener of the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh last year, was the first one to make reference to the water system in a negotiated outcome document in the Sharm el-Sheikh Declaration. So we can now talk about a water system within the context of the negotiations on climate. And of course, there's the energy system. So we're not only talking about the trade in energy and the use of energy, but how the ecosystem works. And though I know we're talking about adaptation, in the Southern Med, don't forget Algeria is oil producing, oil and gas, there's the Gulf, Egypt. They have to adapt also to changing patterns of energy consumption. You know, we talk about energy vulnerability. Now, we all agree we have to reduce the climate and the emissions and the way we work. But in the end, those economies that are founded on energy have to adapt to the changing and the transformation of the global community on the energy demand and how they will have their labor force and their economies adapt to those changes in the demand for those products. So again, these areas of systems then need us to cooperate. And how do we cooperate? Well, there's a lot of intergovernmental work in the Mediterranean. I work in the Arab region, but we do work with the Union for the Mediterranean. Here in Barcelona has worked, Plan Bleu, for the Arab, and I'll let you go on that on the Mediterranean basin. But for the South, there are intergovernmental mechanisms. ESCO itself is an intergovernmental institution. And we have a committee of water, a committee on energy that guides us and says, what do they need from us to cooperate better, to be able to identify joint solutions, because climate has no national boundary. This has to be done across countries. We have to think about watersheds. You cannot think about the Tigris and Euphrates only in Iraq. It's not doable. You have to think about the whole ecosystem. We work on sand and dust storms in the Mashreq. We're using our modeling outputs right now to talk about sand and dust storms with Saudi Arabia, with Iraq, with Kuwait, with Jordan and Syria. And they have to look at this collectively. They cannot answer the problem of sandstorms transboundary. And that's as much in the Sahel. Recently in the Sahel, they were cooperating to try to have now this green belt in the Sahel, because the sands of the Sahel are hitting you in Barcelona, hitting you all the way to Germany. And I think I read recently that it actually hit even Florida, across the Atlantic Ocean, around Cuba and Florida and the United States, the sands of the Sahel. So if we don't cooperate, we're all going to be impacted. So these different areas of cooperation, sectors of cooperation can help us move forward to find success stories and transformations.
In this sense of finance, and technology transfer are the key files to do this cooperation, or not?
Well, just to add though, it's technology transfer is important, appropriate technology, finance, but it's also capacity building and governance. And I would say that's where that link is. But,
I was going to add the same point. I think it goes way beyond technology transfer. And it also imposes us to rethink technology transfer, because we receive. So I didn't explain very clearly what SIAM was, but we are an intergovernmental organization, one of those, and I'm going to mention other ones because it's important to understand that around the Mediterranean. We are an intergovernmental organization that was founded back in 1962 to organize joint higher education in agriculture and rural development. So technology sharing or co-design or training, and that we do also research and we do cooperation at a higher level, being an intergovernmental body. But the more and more what we are seeing is also a demand for technology transfer from the south to the north. Because the conditions of water scarcity, of heat, makes it absolutely important for countries like France, like Spain, like Italy, to also learn from those very dry and hot conditions that have been prevailing in the south. So there is more and more demand for cooperation from south to south country and from south to north country. So technological transfer has to be rethought as as something much more global, and definitely not the only dimension. The question of approach, which type of approach to adaptation, which type of governance system, which type of management policies is very important alongside with technology transfer. And in terms of cooperation, the Mediterranean region is a very interesting region because it has used intergovernmental cooperation at the regional level, and I think that was a point that was made also in the introduction, since almost the end of the Second World War. The first intergovernmental cooperation in the Mediterranean was on fisheries through the General Commission of Fisheries of the Mediterranean region, which is not a decision body, but has been sharing knowledge and co-designing policies since 1949. Then the SIAM was created. Then for environmental issues, the Barcelona Convention was adopted in 1975. So this collaboration, even when there was tensions around the basin, when there was political difficulties, this technical cooperation has lived through. And you mentioned already the Union for the Mediterranean. And more recently, the MEDECC expert group that I mentioned, which is scientific bodies, but strengthen this capacity to cooperate all around the basin. And we speak of intergovernmental organization, but in the Mediterranean, we also have a very rich networks of cooperation between people in parliaments, between cities, between associations, between companies. And for me, the next challenge in terms of cooperation is also how do you strengthen the links between all those networks? And how do we make sure that all the knowledge that part of those actors are developing locally through those networks and through interconnections between those networks, between those different types of actors, they spread around the region.
Okay, thanks. Just before to pass the word to the floor, I would like to ask you, because you mentioned the justice and adaptation. Also, you mentioned the COP in the past COP in Egypt last year, and we for everybody knows that there was this loss damage fund agreement, and I would like to ask you, which are your expectations for the next COP in Dubai? Because with in this country that it's not really very environmental friendly, to say polity.
Well, there's a lot of politics, and it is very impressive that at COP27 at Sharm el-Sheikh, they agreed to address the issue of loss and damage, which has been on the agenda for the developing countries for quite some time. It's landmark that they agreed to establish a financial mechanism to support loss and damage. How that is going to do, how that's going to be assessed, that's still a negotiation process. Okay, so we talk about loss and damage and someone thinks immediately adaptation. But loss and damage, what is being negotiating is it going to prevent loss in the future, or is it compensating for loss that was experienced? They're not quite, they're still talking about this, okay? What we are doing at ESPA is actually working with our sister regional commission at ECLAC, which is the Economic Commission responsible for Latin America and the Caribbean, using a model to assess costs on loss and damage currently, what has been already felt for sea level rise, for example, in the Delta, what is going on in Mauritania, who has, don't forget, an outlet to the Atlantic Ocean as well and is being affected. So how to assess those costs? Is the cost explicit, direct? Is it indirect? What is included in that package? Who's entitled? I mean, the most obvious ones are small island states, those who are also, having issues about damages related to their survival, basically, but also those extreme events. I mean, is Oman, who is not a least developed country by far, they are one of the 6 GCC countries, but Oman is being hit constantly by these cyclones. Are they entitled to get compensation because the seas are now warming from the Atlantic? Maybe. I mean, who is entitled? What methodology shall we apply? That is still a negotiation. I do not expect a decision on the entire setup of the trust fund and how it will work at COP28. I know it's under negotiation. There's actually several committees being discussed. And the science and the knowledge and the methodologies are part of that negotiation that we are informing the ESCWA as well as the network, the Santiago networks that have been established already to exchange knowledge about these issues. So it's one part of adaptation. I would also say that we also have to think about the adaptation goal, the adaptation costs, what is the climate finance, the new agreed to goal that will be set for generating and providing enough finance for climate action in general. Again, before there was that $100 billion goal per year. It's expired. What is the next goal? Where that funding for adaptation, disaster loss, mitigation, action, adaptive capacity, all that's part of a package that has been negotiating, and we can't just look at that part in the equation. It's going to take some time. It's not something that will be set up by end of November.
I hope it will be not they will not spend 30 years to do it.
It's a negotiated outcome. So negotiations involve 170 plus countries.
Okay. I don't know if Ellen, if you want to add something, or we can already pass the word to.
Maybe not on this specific subject, but I'll be happy to give more examples of cooperation, of how we can build up adaptation, but also we spoke about the transformation of the systems, but part of the resilience is also being able to react very quickly in a period of crisis. And I think the cooperation is also an extremely important aspect to improve the resilience in terms of capacity to react together and to react fast. And there are very good examples in other contexts. For example, in terms of pollution accidents. No, I don't know if you wanted to give the floor. Anyways, there are examples of things we work. And for example, in Siam, we support a network for informing of the agricultural condition and sharing information on agricultural condition and food markets around the Mediterranean countries. And we see really this network, which is very, very small, developing because it is rich of all the partnerships it manages to develop with other international institutions, but also more and more with other types of actors. And it could be an example of how to develop cooperation, to have early information on the risks, being international, being national, and better also adapt in the long term and quickly react to a crisis in terms of food systems, as you mentioned, food systems.
Okay, thanks, Ellen. Now it's your turn, so please go ahead if you have any questions. No sé, ¿tenéis micro?
Vale, claro. Pero
I think we can take the questions.
Los ponentes y por la presentación, pero también por los trabajos que desarrollan. A ver,
Apologies, but okay. Thank you so much for the work that you perform in environments. That's my first statement, but the question is the following. We are in a geological climate transformation, which is huge and very fast as well. This is being seen in your presentations. But this wouldn't be the first change we see in humanity of this type. The difference would probably be that now things happen much faster than previously, and humanity has provoked or caused this. The response has always been a cultural transformation by humanity. So culture in the widest sense, in the anthropological sense. So we would have the technological response, the political response you already mentioned. But my question is whether, aside from these responses that you have mentioned here at some point, there's a response. I'm talking about for mitigation and adaptation, right? So do you consider that in some of the levels of culture, in this widest conception, as maybe law or awareness rising or cooperation, are they happening with the same speed and intensity that would be necessary to face this climate emergency? So in other words, are there any other aspects, not maybe economic or technological, but are any other aspects responding to this great cultural transformation that we need?
I think this is the missing link of our presentation. I think if I understand properly the question, I think this is extremely important. And I will just take one example. I'll go back to agriculture and food, because that's what I know. And today we have the Mediterranean region. I was saying 7% of the world population, 3% of the water resources, but 30% of the imports in grain, in cereals. So it's a region that is highly dependent of the rest of the world for its production. And all the trends we have shown today show that it can only get worse in the future. But when we say that, we are missing a piece of the puzzle in terms of providing the answer if we don't look at the behavior, how are people eating, and what is the culture, and what are the food habits, and how they have evolved. Because we always say the Mediterranean diet is the best diet around the world. But when we look at what people today eat around the Mediterranean basin, the Mediterranean diet, unfortunately, in many places, in many occasions, it's disappearing. And some of its basics are disappearing today. And I looked at some, I'm not a nutritionist, but I looked at some of the nutritional balances around the basin, in the north and in the south, and it's extremely dependent on wheat. Most of the proteins, most of the calories, but also most of the proteins today are based on wheat. And in some countries, most of the food are actually wheat, sugar, and oil. And some of the food policies have supported those products that the countries depend on and the society depends on. But we also have a huge nutritional issue in the north as in the south. We have countries like Greece, Turkey, Egypt, even Italy to some point, or Morocco, where the rate of obesity has increased tremendously. For example, we have 40% obesity in women today in Egypt, for example. And this is a trend that is increasing very much with the youth. And it's very difficult to imagine how we are going to find solution for adapting to the agriculture to climate change if we don't think about how we are going to change the cultural habits of eating and how we are going to reintroduce some of the traditions of the Mediterranean diet that unfortunately are not part of the current or less part of the current habits, how we are going to reintroduce legumes, for example, like peas, like lentils, like chickpeas, that are very important in the culture, but are grown less and less in the Mediterranean countries, are eaten less and less. So the question of transforming behavior in many aspects, including nutrition, through different culture is extremely important. And I think that's very important part of the missing link when we speak about technologies, when we speak about policies, the question of consumption and habits is very important. And I think the European policy that looks at agriculture from farm to fork and look at consumer behavior as well is a very good step in this, in looking at the whole food system, including the cultural aspects. Sorry, I was a bit long, but no, but it's very important to me.
And you are very passionate for this issue. It's okay. I don't know if Carol, do you want to add something, or maybe we can pass to another question?
Just to say the idea of education for culture, the youth. The youth are now the center. In the UN and the global community now, we are engaging youth as the activists for the future in order to make change in the present. And that is also a change in culture. You know, I'm sure here, you know, in the South, it's always the respect for the doctor, the learned, the one who has been in government for decades. Now the people who come to our meetings, they're young and they're women. The environment sector has changed, and this is a cultural change in the way that we, who we are talking to. I mean, we see it here, but I mean, I used to work in the water sector. I'd be the only woman in the room for the water sector. In the environment sector, which unfortunately sometimes climate is still considered environment, I don't agree. I think climate change is an agriculture, water, and energy, health. It's across sectors. But in the environment sector, you get more women and you get a lot more young people. And that is a cultural change because awareness, education, the tools of knowledge, the speed of transformation is increasing. And that's why I have hope for tomorrow.
Okay, we can pass to another question.
Okay, well, first, thank you so much for the presentation. It was really interesting. Now, you've been talking about cooperation between the Mediterranean countries, right? But I wonder how much we can do if the rest of the countries in the world, like China, that is now in development, and I don't know, India and even the USA, they keep like consuming as they are doing. And if we actually can do something about it, or we just need to brace for impact and see how we can adapt to that.
You want to talk mitigation, or shall I talk mitigation? You know, we're all in this together. This is the phrase. We all have to work on the adaptation, on the mitigation goals. There's no question. There was, you know, in the Arab region, we used to say, well, we might might be many of the countries that produce oil and that their emissions are high, but in the end, everyone has to commit to reducing those emissions. And it's not only carbon emissions, but emissions of methane and others, to collectively achieve that goal. Now, getting the highest polluters, and it's China, it's India, who's a developing country, it's America, the United States, it's others who are emitting by volume a lot more. We know that here in the European Union, though, there's this ebb and tide of how ambition can go. Well, I think Europe is probably the most ambitious of all the groups to push the envelope forward for acting, and they are bringing the others behind, along with them. It is a negotiated process because in the end, there is a principle from way back to the Rio Convention in 1992, common but differentiated responsibilities. And countries do have an opportunity to grow. The question is how we can leap for how there can be the investment, how that collectively we can help the technology be transferred appropriately and the resources be put there, both resources that are financial and human capacities, to move that envelope forward and encourage a transformation. I mean, there's more people now that use mobile phones and fixed telephones. I don't know that statistics. Let's say there's a lot more people with new housing might jump and leapfrog into mobiles and this. I don't have the exact statistic, but there are opportunities to leapfrog and to make transformational change. And I think it's a collective negotiation when we see the disasters that everyone, and China is one of them, droughts. Right now, they have a world conference going on addressing the challenge of water scarcity. I mean, there are leadership opportunities there to show change, and I think there's opportunities that collectively, from governments to civil society, to push the needle forward.
Thanks. I think there was another question. I don't know if there is, how many questions would we want? Another one? Two more? Okay, because we have only 5 minutes, so we can take these two last questions. Thanks.
Again, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting from both sides. It's amazing to have someone with another perspective outside of Europe, which is awesome, and with a gender perspective, which is great. Again. So now we go back to our houses and we have a lot of data, which is awesome. But my question for you is, do you have like 3 to 5 items that we can change, like maybe like advices or things that would be nice to start doing or stop even doing that you can throw to us today?
You don't want to. So you're advertising. You're going to talk about the system. Lots of damage, lots of way.
Go ahead.
Okay. You know, everyone can act. Obviously, we want governments to agree on action, but there are things that we can each do. If we were talking about food. In the food systems negotiations that happened in Rome, there was a summit that happened in Rome in July. Part of the equation is food loss and waste. We talk about loss and damage, but also thinking about that systems approach. Whatever you're not eating off the table at the end, it's not that you've lost that food and lost the income or the money used, but from the very beginning, that means there was pesticides, there was fertilizer, there was water, there was land, there was income that was lost from the whole cycle. So that change in behavior, which again, Europe is much more ahead than others in terms of being more efficient in consumption, from food to energy to water use. Again, Spain, one of the leaders in terms of trying to increase the efficiency of water use here because you had such a dramatic challenge with the drought recently. There are behaviors that we can save, and that's every single step of the way. And by that leadership, people follow. I was impressed today. I haven't been to Barcelona for about 8-10 years. I don't remember the bicycle paths that you have here. I mean, that's a choice. Right now at the summit in New York, my executive secretary is there. My head of agency at ESQA, the head of UNEP is there. There's public transportation. People are using public transportation. Taxis are there, but there's choices every day that you can make on your life to be part of that and to advocate. Advocate for not only your country and the benefits of the national development needs of your country, but also for those who are more vulnerable, so they have the resources to also develop and also meet their climate commitments. Advocacy, so that's part of the equation.
Yeah, I just want to add up on this advocacy aspect, because I think what is also important at our level is how we contribute to inventing a desirable future with different consumption patterns. We saw that if consumption behavior don't change, it's very difficult to change the whole system. But we also see that locally there are solutions being invented, and there are, for example, solutions to reduce food waste, to reduce food transport, the footprint of the transportation of food across oceans, and less water, the water footprint, the energy footprint of the food we consume. So there are solutions to reinvent that. There is a lot of work on short circuits in food systems, and I think all those innovations are great. But there is also a role that we are very often missing. And I was trying to organize a conference last year, and I was looking for a speaker who could speak about a desirable future under those conditions. And I know that those solutions are invented. At least in Europe, there are many things. People are starting to desire things that are different from the generations before. They are starting to consume things that are maybe less material, but are still very important. There is a regain in arts, in appreciating other things, but there are very few people that actually carry that as a discourse, as an alternative. There is a lot of people carry, I mean, we know the damages. We know the amplitude of the risk, but it's very difficult to think that we will change unless there is also a positive view of what we are moving towards. It's different. It's a different society. It's not the same consumption. It's a different culture, but it needs to also be desired. We speak about youth a lot that are going to be the future of the region. What are they aspiring to, and how are we, and not us, but themselves, publicizing this view of a different future that can be desirable, even though it's much less impacting all the resources that are becoming more scarce. But we can consume something else, exchanging, being together, short circuits. I mean, we see all the values of that, and we are seeing them at the moment in Europe. And it's biking, and it's all those things that we can appreciate, and it's not a solution by default. The problem in a lot of the developing countries is that they are adapting by default. We are lucky enough in Europe to be able to be adapting by choice also, and we can carry this message and make it something more visible.
Thanks. The last question, it's yeah. Here.
Hola, muchas gracias por la exposición.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation and for all the work carried out. But I am quite depressed because I think this is a totally unbalanced fight and struggle. Totally, because whereas we see organizations telling us how we can mitigate all the effects of climate change and so on and so forth, I believe that while some mitigate and try to find solutions to improve those things that we have damaged, there are very powerful organizations, financial organizations, that see no interest in this car production and clothes production and whatever you want. Apart from that, I'm not explaining myself properly, I know, but what we get into our heads in terms of commercials, advertising, changes of lifestyle, that are truly against your ideals. You yourself are doing lots of things that go against yourself, and you do all those things because you have all those people promoting something that is actually worsening, damaging all this climate change issue. For instance, intensive agriculture, intensive production of fruit. In Barcelona, you can see fruit shops all around. Why do we have so much fruit? Are we just going to throw it away after? Because, you know, there's a lot of money involved. I see a lot of goodwill in all these organizations and institutions, but I would like to know, how are we going to have an effect on those which are the ones who are actually polluting our planet? And we're just a tiny little ant saying, hey, let's see if we recycle our paper, our cardboard, and our plastic. And youth is moving for climate change, yes, but they eat fast food the most. Why? Because of their life conditions, because of the economy, because it's much cheaper, because they have no money. They themselves are going against all this. You watch a concert and you see all the waste that is left behind when the concert is over. So how are we having an impact on the education of these young people so that they can have an effect on governments, so that governments limit these intensive limitation, this intensive farming, this intensive agriculture? Who are the ones who consume the most? These packages that you get home. I don't think it's older people, it's the younger people who order food deliveries, and Barcelona is full of cars taking deliveries to your home. So how can we change that mentality, that mindset? If the adverts that we see on TV bomb us with this need that we must have in order to have the latest book in my house and not going to the library, just having it brought home. I mean, it's all this and much more. Could you be a bit more specific with your question, please? No, what I mean is I would like to know what is being done so that all these people are not consuming more and more of this rubbish that has such a huge effect in climate change. Thank you. I know I'm not a scientist stating all this. It is my word and the word of the street, but this is how I feel it. No problem with that, of course. But sometimes in order to translate, they might have lost some details. So if your question is more specific, it'll be easier for them to answer. Thank you very much for your intervention.
No, I think it goes totally with the last intervention I tried to make. I think these cultural changes, they are part of the equation. We need those cultural changes, and we need these positive models of different type of consumption, because there is this trend. And we see it in the big picture. We don't just see it in the street or after a concert. We see it in the big picture when we see the trends in consumption around the Mediterranean basin. And it's young people. It's also, I mean, I was reading a study about child labor in agriculture in Turkey, for example, and some of the only affordable food that people will give as to please the kids are carbonated sodas. And yes, we have to provide alternative. It's a joint responsibility to provide affordable alternatives and also to provide alternative message of what is desirable. And in the youth population, it's not only the institution, it's not only the older generation who is going to be able to provide these desirable messages and those desirable images. I think the implication of the youth is extremely important in this regard, and that's why I was calling for that just before. But there is also responsibility in public policies, and it's a very difficult balance between my people need enough bread, and that's a social issue, it's a food issue, it's a political issue. There could be social unrest if tomorrow in some countries there is not enough affordable bread. But at the same time, I need to find a way to go back to a more balanced food system and a more balanced agriculture, including with crops that are very necessary if we want to move towards agroecology, towards better soils, less water resources, and a more balanced diet. How, as a government, am I able to balance the challenges of the very short term and the challenges of the long term? And that's a constant preoccupations that the scientific community, international organization, national and local governments have. So it is at the level of the communication, the consumption habit. It is also a global responsibility and a policy of responsibility at every level of governance, but a challenge.
I'll just add one story to that. And I think there's cause for optimism. I know it's overwhelming, the challenges being faced, and actually there's even psychologists now thinking about the pessimism of what might happen because of climate change. But just a quick story, why I have an optimistic view on this. About a year ago, I was asked to peer review a publication by our colleagues in Cairo with UNESCO. And you're saying that this building is now endorsed as a UNESCO site. And the publication was a survey of Arab youth that they had done online and in person about climate change and sustainable development. And we were talking before about the Sustainable Development Goals, which have to do with climate, but also have to do with poverty and education and wealth and various parts. And when I was reading it, it was evident that the youth out there did not understand the difference between climate change and sustainable development. The way that they were interpreting the words were the same. And I read this in my instinct as a practitioner in the water sector that has the Sustainable Development Goals in one way of processes and climate change as another processes, the Paris Agreement negotiations, and then New York and the Sustainable Development Goals. And as I read the publication more, I realized they were right and my mentality was wrong, because they were thinking of it, there's no difference. We have to think about our development needs and our climate needs together. And the fact that Arab youth, after, and I'm sure this is happening in Europe, we know with Greta and all the other movements that happen, but the fact that for them, there was no differentiation between the way I develop my society and look forward and the way I think about climate, I realized by the end of the publication that they were right. We cannot look at it in isolation. People are already recognizing that there is a need to look at this together in everything that we do. It is complicated to do solutions that are integrated. But every step is a way forward, and the awareness gets us to move that needle forward. And I have optimism that together we can achieve that. Both those who have been in the field for decades and those who are coming in behind us to make a change, because we are seeing it every day and they are seeing it, and they realize that by their action, they are pushing us forward also to act and adapt to the challenges that we collectively face.
Yeah, and to just give another example of this complementarity, in terms of food system in France, there have been a lot of innovation for local food system, for going back to procuring your food locally, with a lot of associative movements developing, with people getting together to buy from a local producer, even finance the crop even before it's planted, and getting whatever products is of season. And this has been developing for a few decades. It's not a huge quantity, but thereafter, the national policy changed. And because this movement already existed, there is now a mandatory local procurement for food for the school food. So this is quite a high percentage. 20-30% of the food has to be procured either bio or locally or both. And this is actually a scale-up change. But it was rendered possible because there is both local initiative and then public decisions. And we have seen changes in the way, at least, school food is being procured, the type of food, the nutrition balance, the locality of its procurement, and it is a quantitative change. It's of scale. It's not just a little detail. And I think these are examples, but they are necessarily to advance together, promising cases and public decisions.
Thanks, Ellen. Thanks, Carol. I think it's a good way to close this dialogue. We talk a lot about a lot of issues, but I think that cooperation is really the crucial word in this adaptation issue. Thanks all for being with us tonight. I will remember that this is the first session of this new cycle that I started today. The next sessions, it will be 4th October, and it will be about the sea rise in the Mediterranean Sea. But there will be other sessions that will be focused in agriculture, that we talk quite a lot, but there will be a specific session about this topic, also about cities, about forests, and also about seas. So we will wait for you to see you again soon. Thanks a lot.